Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into a critical topic for all of us in eye care, myopia.
Hmm.
It's not just, a simple refractive error anymore, is it? It's become this alarming global trend.
Absolutely. The prevalence has basically doubled in just 3 decades. It's especially noticeable in urban areas, particularly East and Southeast Asia.
Exactly. So we're going to break down a really significant article today. It's Optical and Visual Diet in Myopia by Susanna Marcos, published in IOVS.
Yeah, it's a fantastic paper. It gives us a really valuable framework for understanding how these environmental shifts are hitting our younger patients so hard.
It really focuses on this idea of the visual diet, doesn't it?
It does. That whole mix of spatial, temporal, chromatic stuff hitting the retina.
Right, the signals that are meant to guide emetropization.
But in eyes developing myopia, something in those signals, or maybe the eye's response to them, seems to kick off that excessive axial elongation cascade.
So our mission today is to really unpack the uh, the building blocks for computational models of these eyes, look at the critical optical and structural data.
And explore those mechanisms behind myopia, especially that interplay between environment and optics.
We want to get a clearer picture of this really complex problem. See what I did there? Clearer picture.
Huh, very good. And what's great about the article is it really aims to equip us, give us the knowledge to build better predictive models
hmm
and eventually test new optical treatments for myopia control. It's a truly comprehensive look.
Definitely. And just quickly for everyone listening, if you want to dive even deeper into this research yourself, we've put a link to the full study right there in the description of this deep dive.
Good call.
Okay, so let's start with the basics, the static picture. The article details these distinct optical and geometrical properties of myopic eyes. What jumps out first?
Well, the big one, no surprise, is the longer axial length. Compared to emmetropes and hyperopes, it's significantly longer.
Right.
There was that huge meta-analysis, over 60,000 eyes,
Wow.
and it found a mean difference of 1.139 millimeters.
Which, okay, sounds tiny, but in terms of the eye,
It's a huge stretch. Think about adding, I don't know, a couple of credit cards, thickness-wise, to the back of the eye. It changes everything optically.
that really puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
So does the cornea follow suit? Does it get steeper?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The results are, well, they're conflicting, frankly.
Oh.
Yeah, some studies show steeper central corneas, others find no real correlation, some even find flatter corneas and longer eyes.
Huh.
The big meta-analysis you mentioned, Zhang et al., did find a slightly larger average corneal curvature in myopes, about a quarter diopter.
Okay.
But the takeaway, clinically, is that corneal radius is super variable. It seems more related to the overall eye size, not just the axial length on its own.
So you can't assume.
Exactly. You have to measure both axial length and corneal curvature. Because, a flatter cornea in someone who isn't even a very high myopia might be hiding a really long axial length. That's critical.
Right. Absolutely critical for catching things early. Okay, so cornea is complex. What about the lens inside? Does it thin out?
Yes, and that's
Wow.
much more consistent. The data pretty clearly shows myopes tend to have thinner crystalline lenses, and they have lower power too.
Okay.
There was a longitudinal study in kids, and that Zhang meta-analysis again, both reported significantly thinner lenses in high myopes, about 0.046 millimeters thinner on average.
Mm-hmm.
And Mirliterin et al. Found this statistically significant decrease in both thickness and power as axial length increased. So,
Well,
like the lens is trying to compensate,
yeah.
Stretching as the eye elongates.
Try to fight the tide almost.
Yeah, exactly. But ultimately, it seems it can't keep up.
Fascinating. And angle lambda. Any consistent skew there?
Yep, myopes consistently show a lower angle lambda. It fits with the fovea, maintaining a relatively constant physical distance from the optical axis, even as the eye gets longer. It's a subtle structural marker.
Okay. And pupils. Bigger in myopes. Letting more light in. Influencing that visual diet.
Results are a bit mixed there, too. But some studies do show larger pupils in myopes than emmetropes, both when relaxed and when accommodating.
And that would affect image quality, retinal illuminance?
For sure, it could definitely play into the whole visual diet equation
Mm-hmm.
and the signals the retina's getting.
Right. What about aberrations? Is the myopic eye's focus just inherently fuzzier, like higher spherical aberration?
Actually, it's often the opposite for spherical aberration.
Yeah.
A pretty recurrent finding is significantly lower positive fourth-order spherical aberration in myopes.
Lower. Okay.
Yeah, it seems linked to a more prolate corneal shape.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some studies show increased overall aberrations, but others don't find a strong link. It might be more about specific types of aberration changing rather than just more blur overall.
Interesting. Okay, last piece of the static puzzle, the peripheral retina. Is there that consistent hyperopic blur out there we hear about?
Well, myopic kids often do show relative peripheral hyperopia, especially horizontally.
Yeah.
But here's the key thing the article stresses. It could very well be a consequence of the axial elongation, not the cause.
Okay. The chicken or the egg.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Overall, myopes tend to have less myopia peripherally than centrally. But whether that peripheral state drives the myopia, the evidence leans towards it being an effect of the growth, not the trigger.
So, okay, summing up the static view. Definite differences, longer axis, thinner lens, angle lambda shift, maybe pupil size, specific aberration changes, but also a lot of variability, especially cornea and periphery.
Precisely. Which really highlights why we need customized eye models to understand that unique optical diet for each myopic eye.
Right, but that's the snapshot. The real mystery, the thing we grapple with clinically, is how the eye changes. What happens dynamically as myopia develops?
That's where longitudinal studies are gold. They show us the process.
Yeah.
The cornea, generally, it stabilizes pretty early, like age 2 or 3. It doesn't seem to be actively driving things later on.
Okay, so cornea's mostly set early.
Right. But the axial length and the crystalline lens, they go through huge dynamic changes right during that critical window when myopia develops.
So the lens is playing an active role then. It's not just passively stretching.
It really seems so. Eyes that are destined to become myopic show this rapid decrease in lens power, along with the increase in axial length, and often this happens before myopia is even officially diagnosed.
Wow. So it's compensating.
It looks like it. This faster loss of lens power seems to be trying to counteract the faster axial growth, essentially postponing the onset of myopia.
But eventually.
Eventually, it can't keep up. The exact mechanisms, how the lens thins and loses power, whether it's truly active or just passive, that's still being worked out, but it definitely looks like the eye is trying to self-correct.
That's a crucial insight. And as this progression continues, what happens to the peripheral optics dynamically?
Well, as the eye gets longer, mainly axially, you do see shifts towards peripheral hyperopia. But, and this is important, studies found that the baseline peripheral refraction didn't predict the risk of developing myopia later.
Reinforcing that idea it's a consequence.
Exactly. It consistently points to those peripheral differences being an outcome of the growth, not the starting point.
Okay, let's pivot to near work. It's always linked, especially now. How does accommodation, the focusing mechanism, fit into this dynamic picture?
Yeah, the big debate is always, is a poor accommodative response a cause or just another consequence?
Right.
What is consistent, though, in both kids and adults is that myopes have larger accommodative lags.
Meaning they don't focus quite accurately enough for near tasks?
Precisely. So they're exposed to more hyperopic defocus during near work. And we know hyperopic defocus is a potential myopiagenic signal. They're basically getting a longer signal more often during near tasks.
And does this extra effort, or maybe this inaccuracy, affect the lens structure itself during accommodation?
It seems to. Studies using OCT, optical coherence tomography, show that myopes actually get larger increases in lens thickness and more posterior pole movement for each diopter they accommodate compared to emmetropes.
So they need more physical change in the lens for the same focusing power.
It looks that way.
Right.
They need greater lens reshaping. Even the ciliary muscle acts differently. Maybe smaller thickness changes, but larger overall movements. And interestingly, if you make people accommodate for a sustained period, only the myopes show a lingering myopic shift afterwards.
That makes you wonder. Could intraocular pressure, IOP, be involved somehow in all this strain?
It's definitely controversial, but yeah, accommodation can change IOP. And some studies specifically show an increase in IOP during accommodation, particularly in progressing myopes, but not in stable emmetropes.
And given that myopia involves scleral changes, maybe underload?
Exactly. Increased scleral creep rate under load, like potentially higher IOP during near work. It's a plausible link that needs more research, for sure.
Okay, to track all these subtle changes, biometry, optics, accommodation, we need incredibly precise tools. What's state of the art now?
Well, for refraction itself, aberrometry is really coming into its own. It gives you the whole picture, low and high order aberrations, and gets values closest to subjective refraction.
Right, more than just sphere and Silas.
Definitely. And those wavefront sensor-based autofractors, the ones that are binocular and see-through, very promising for clinical use, fast, accurate.
And for axial length, the absolute key metric for tracking progression.
We've largely moved away from ultrasound. Optical methods are king, now low. or partial coherence interferometry, swept source OCT. The repeatability is amazing, like 0.01 millimeter.
Incredible precision.
It is. Now, choroidal thickness, it gets mentioned. It's not really used in optical modeling itself, but it's being looked at as maybe a potential biomarker for defocus responses or short-term treatment
But
effects.
tricky to measure reliably.
Very tricky. It's thin, variable, yeah, challenging.
And going deeper, things like lens shape or even cone spacing, how do we measure those?
For the lens shape and its internal gradient index, the
Yeah.
OCT and MRI are the tools. You can get full 3D images, even estimate the GRI in vivo, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Ciliary rumple. Transcleral OCT lets us quantify its volume and movement during accommodation. And for photoreceptors, cone spacing. Adaptive optics, AO, that gives you super high-res images. Wow. And AO studies have shown that in myopes, the foveal cones spread out, but at a slower rate than the eye elongates overall, so the packing density changes.
These tools really let us see the eye in unprecedented detail. Which brings us to the core question. The why. How does optical blur actually trigger myopia? The article digs into this retinal signal.
Right. This is where it gets really fundamental. Animal models are pretty clear. You can induce myopia with two main types of blur. Negative lenses, which cause defocus.
Making the eye want to grow longer to reach focus.
Exactly. And the other is form deprivation using diffusers or occluders that just kill the contrast, wash out the detail.
Okay. And we see parallels in humans.
We do. Natural form deprivation, like from congenital cataracts or corneal issues, consistently leads to longer eyes, more myopia, and even indirectly if you overcorrect kids after cataract surgery, making them effectively hyperopic.
Like putting a negative lens on them.
Right. Their eyes tend to grow longer too. It lines up with the animal models. Blur, specifically hyperopic defocus or just lack of form, signals growth.
But here's the million-dollar question. If blur is the signal, how does the eye know which way to grow? How does it detect the sign of defocus? Is it trying to focus on something blurry in front or behind the retina?
That is the crux of it, isn't it?
Mm.
How does it get the direction right? Or, in myopia, how does it get it wrong? There are several proposed mechanisms, and likely multiple things are involved.
Okay, like what?
One is spherical aberration. Because it's asymmetrical, the way blur changes as you go through focus isn't the same in front versus behind. That asymmetry could potentially signal positive versus negative defocus, like a built-in directional cue.
Interesting. A sort of optical signpost.
Kind of. Then there's chromatic aberration, LCA, longitudinal chromatic aberration. Blue light focuses shorter than red light.
Right.
So maybe if the blue component of an image is sharper than the red, that signal's focus is too far back, need to elongate. Animal studies give some support, but it varies between species. And in humans, some work suggests myopes might have reduced sensitivity to blue light, S-cone stimuli, which could mess up this cue.
Okay. Chromatic cues. What else?
Astigmatism, especially peripheral astigmatism. Combined with defocus, it creates blur patterns with different orientations. Maybe the orientation of the blur encodes the sign. Myopes often do have different peripheral blur patterns than emmetropes.
So the pattern of blur matters, not just the amount.
Possibly. Another idea focuses on high spatial frequencies. The theory is that lots of fine detail, high spatial frequency energy, actually inhibits eye growth. Even if you scramble the face, just having that energy present seems protective. So maybe modern environments lack enough of this.
Okay. Less fine detail stimulus.
And finally, temporal modulations. Think about our tiny eye movements, fixational eye movements. As the eye jitters, the image moves on the retina. The way the blur changes over time during these movements might provide cues about the sign of defocus.
Wow, that's subtle, using the eye's own movements to decode blur.
Yeah, it's complex. And what makes it even harder is that things we used to think caused myopia, like maybe that peripheral hyperopia, are looking more like consequences again. And then there's the whole debate about contrast. Does high contrast stop growth, like the classical view? Or does high contrast, like reading text up close, actually drive growth, as a newer theory proposes?
So it's still quite murky.
It really is. Which leads to that big question, are myopic eyes actually faulty? Are they failing to read the sign of defocus correctly? Or are they actually emmetropizing appropriately, but just to a visual world that's overwhelmingly biased towards near focus and maybe lacks the right protective signals?
That's a paradigm shift. Maybe the eye is doing its job, but the job description has changed because of our environment.
Precisely. Which brings us squarely to the environment itself. Because this rapid rise in myopia just has to be environmental, right? Genetics don't change that fast.
Absolutely. So what are the key environmental factors the article highlights?
Okay, number one, near work. The evidence linking near-work reading screens, close tasks to myopia is just overwhelming now.
Yeah, we see it all the time.
Studies show something like an 80% higher risk for kids doing more near work. And the specifics matter. Working closer than 30 centimeters, doing it for more than 30 minutes without a break, those are big risk factors.
That Israeli study was striking too, wasn't it?
Phenomenal. Comparing the educational systems, you had 82% myopia in ultra-Orthodox schools with really intensive reading from a young age versus about 30% in secular schools. That's a huge difference, driven by lifestyle, by the visual diet.
Wow. Okay, near work is huge. What else? Urban versus rural.
Another consistent finding, myopia is way more common in cities. Why? Well, urban scenes tend to have less high spatial frequency content compared to natural environments. Their spectral slope is steeper.
Meaning less fine detail.
Less fine detail, statistically. It might actually mimic form deprivation blur, like putting a weak diffuser over the eyes, potentially triggering growth. Our cities might literally be blurring our vision, optically speaking.
That's a wild thought. Okay, what about light? Outdoor time.
Massive factor. Kids who spend more time outdoors are less myopic. It's one of the most consistent protective factors we know of.
And it's not just about looking far away.
Probably not just that. Outdoor light intensity is orders of magnitude higher than indoors. We're talking over 100,000 lux sometimes, versus maybe 500 lux inside.
Huge difference.
And that high-intensity light is thought to stimulate dopamine release in the retina, and dopamine seems to act as a stop signal for axial elongation.
So sunlight is literally protective medicine for the eye.
It seems that way. And related to light is the timing circadian rhythms. Messing with a light-dark cycle, like constant light or darkness in animal models, disrupts normal eye growth.
And in humans, our modern lighting, screens at night.
Exactly. Artificial light, screens used late. It extends our light exposure, messes with melatonin production, shifts our circadian rhythms. And guess what? Myopic kids often do show altered circadian timing, lower melatonin. It suggests our whole 2047 lit world might be disrupting fundamental growth signals.
It really sounds like a perfect storm.
It really is.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, these things are all interwoven, aren't they?
Yeah. Near work happens indoors. Urban settings mean less outdoor time and different visual scenes.
Right. It's cumulative.
Yeah.
Think about a kid doing homework indoors, maybe under dim light, then spending hours on a phone. They're hitting multiple risk factors at once. Near work, maybe poor light, disrupted sleep patterns, lack of outdoor time and light, maybe less optimal spatial frequencies.
It all adds up.
It all adds up to promote axial elongation. We even saw it during the COVID lockdowns, didn't we? Less outdoor time, more screen time, and reports of increased myopia progression followed.
A real-world, unfortunate experiment. So, given how complex this visual diet is, how do we actually measure it accurately? Parent questionnaires are, well...
Yeah, they're notoriously unreliable. Subjective recall is tough. So there's a huge push for objective measurement tools.
like wearables.
Exactly. Wearable tech is emerging fast. You've got things like spectacle-mounted light meters, accelerometers to track activity, even rangefinders to measure working distance.
I've heard of the Clue Clip.
Yeah, devices like that can monitor working distance and even the light level right near the eyes. The key, really, is capturing the light and the spatial content from the person's actual line of sight.
Not just ambient room light.
Right. We need to measure what the eye is actually seeing to get a true picture of that individual's visual diet.
Makes perfect sense. Wow, okay. We've covered a lot. This deep dive has really highlighted just how multifaceted myopia is. From the eye zone geometry and optics
To these incredibly complex interactions with our environment, our light exposure, our habits.
It's definitely not simple.
Not at all. But understanding these mechanisms, how blur gets decoded, how the visual diet impacts growth, it's absolutely crucial if we want to figure out interventions that can actually, stem the tide.
So for everyone listening, for us as eye care professionals, what's the big takeaway here? This isn't just interesting research, is it?
No, it's directly applicable. It gives us the grounding, the insights to better guide our patients, especially the young ones. We need to think beyond just the prescription.
Maybe we should be thinking about prescribing a better visual diet, more outdoor time, managing near work.
Absolutely. It's about advising on the whole visual environment. And the research pushing for better eye models, for objective ways to measure that environment. It points towards a future of much more personalized prevention and control strategies.
Giving us much better acuity into the problem.
Exactly. Sharpening our focus, you could say.
This has been really insightful. Another great deep dive. If you, listening, enjoyed this conversation and want more like it, please make sure you follow the deep dive wherever you get your podcasts.
Hmm.
And hey, if you really like what you heard today, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps other eye care professionals discover these discussions.
It does make a difference.
So until next time, keep observing, keep learning, and definitely keep asking those deep questions.